The negotiation chamber on Threnvax station smelled of ozone and fear. Ambassador Vell Kaathrix of the Ninth Spire had seen violence before. The crawling kind, the political kind, the kind that came wrapped in smiles and poison-laced tea. She had never seen this. 3 draconian enforcers lay on the polished obsidian floor, unconscious, their armored carapaces dented inward like crushed cans. A 4th was pinned against the wall, feet dangling a full half-meter off the ground, held there by a single hand wrapped around his throat plate. The hand belonged to a man who, until 90 seconds ago, Vell had only known as the Quiet One, her bodyguard, Corven Ashe, a human who filled out his uniform without filling a room, who spoke maybe 6 words a day, who she'd privately assumed was decorative, a treaty requirement from the Sol Compact. Nothing more. He wasn't decorative now. His knuckles were split open and didn't seem to notice. His breathing was slow, measured, almost bored. Blue draconi blood ran in a thin line from a cut above his eye, and he blinked it away like it was rain. Corven. Vell's voice cracked. She had never once heard it crack in 11 years of diplomatic service. Corven, stop, he looked at her, and for one terrible second, his eyes weren't the eyes of the polite young man who held doors and carried her briefcase and laughed quietly at jokes he pretended not to understand. They were flat, calculating, old, in a way that had nothing to do with years. Then something behind them shifted back into place, and he was just Corven again. He set the enforcer down, gently, almost apologetically, and turned to the stunned Draconi delegation still seated at the negotiation table, none of whom had moved a muscle. My apologies for the interruption, he said, in the same flat, quiet tone he always used. Ambassador Kaathrix, should we continue the meeting, or would you prefer a short recess? Nobody in that room breathed for 3 full seconds. The Draconi speaker, Vantu, a 9-foot mountain of scaled muscle, who had personally overseen the extermination of a rebel colony, stared at the human like he was looking at a ghost. His voice, when it finally came, had lost every trace of its earlier arrogance. What are you? Corven tilted his head slightly, as if the question confused him. I'm her bodyguard, sir. But none of this had begun that way. 3 days earlier, Ambassador Vell Kaathrix had barely registered Corven Ashe's presence at all. The Sol Compact had insisted on providing security personnel for every diplomat visiting Threnvax Station, a neutral trade hub orbiting a gas giant in contested space between 6 major galactic powers. Vell had expected an entourage. Instead, Earth sent 1 man. He was unremarkable to look at. Average height, average build, brown hair kept short and practical, the kind of face that blurred into a crowd. He carried no visible weapon. He said little. When Vell had asked him, half joking, whether he could actually protect her from anything, he'd simply said, I hope it doesn't come to that, and left it there. She'd assumed it was false modesty or incompetence. Humanity was, after all, a relatively new addition to galactic society. Barely 40 years since first contact, still scrambling to build alliances, still treated by most species as a curiosity at best and a liability at worst. The Draconi ascendancy in particular considered humans soft, fragile, a species from a garden world, coddled by mild gravity and gentle seasons, unworthy of a seat at the true negotiating tables. Vell hadn't disagreed with that assessment, not really. Not until the second day everything changed in the next few seconds. Though at the time she didn't even notice it happening, it was a small thing. An elevator malfunction sent the lift car into a brief freefall of perhaps 2 meters before the emergency brakes caught. Vell had shrieked and stumbled. Corven hadn't moved at all, hadn't even reached for a rail. He'd simply adjusted his stance a half-second before the drop, as though he'd felt it coming through the floor. How did you know that was going to happen? She'd asked afterward, unsettled. I didn't, he'd said. I just don't fall easily. She'd let it go. She had bigger problems, namely, that the trade negotiations between the Sol Compact, the Draconi Ascendancy, and 4 smaller species blocks were collapsing by the hour, and the Draconi speaker seemed determined to provoke a walkout that would hand the entire sector's mining rights to his people by default. The Kel had made a terrible mistake in underestimating what humanity had already survived, and they were about to find out exactly how large that mistake was. Earth, as it turned out, was not a garden world. This detail had somehow never made it into the Draconi intelligence briefings, buried as it was beneath 4 decades of dismissive assumptions. Humans looked soft. Humans apologized too much. Humans built art museums and wrote poetry and cried at films. Surely a species like that had evolved somewhere gentle? They had not. Earth's gravity sat comfortably mid-range for habitable worlds. True, but its biosphere had spent 4 billion years locked in an arms race with itself. Predators that hunted in coordinated packs, pathogens that mutated by the hour, a planet that alternated between ice ages and firestorms, that birthed megafauna with teeth the length of forearms, that had tried, repeatedly, creatively, relentlessly, to erase its own dominant species at every stage of its development. Humans hadn't survived Earth by being strong. They'd survived by being worse than everything trying to kill them. Smarter, meaner, more patient, more willing to adapt in an afternoon, what evolution usually took millennia to solve. Corven Ashe had grown up in the Sahel Reclamation Zone, one of the last regions on Earth still classified as hazard active, a stretch of reclaimed desert where solar storms fried electronics twice a year, where reintroduced predator species roamed in numbers nobody had quite planned for, and where the nearest hospital was an 11-hour drive on a good day. He joined the Compact's Special Threat Division at 19. By 26, he'd been quietly rotated into diplomatic protection. Not because he was the strongest soldier Earth had, but because he was, according to his file, exceptionally calm under conditions that kill most people. Vell knew none of this, not yet. Nobody knew what the human was hiding, least of all the ambassador he'd been assigned. To protect the ambush came on the 3rd day, timed perfectly to the moment negotiations were meant to resume. Vell had stepped into the private antechamber outside the main hall to review her notes one final time. Corven trailed a respectful 3 paces behind, as always. Neither of them noticed the 4 Draconi enforcers, not station security, but Hral Vantu's personal guard, until the doors sealed behind them with a pneumatic hiss. "A private word, Ambassador," Vantu had said, stepping from the shadows of a side corridor, his scaled face arranged into something that might have been a smile. "Before the formal session, I think it's time you understood who truly holds leverage in this sector. It wasn't a negotiation. It was a message. Sign the mineral rights over to Draconi control, quietly, before the cameras came on, or something unfortunate would happen to the human garden species who kept getting in his people's way." Vell had opened her mouth to protest, to threaten a diplomatic incident, to do anything except what actually happened next. What actually happened next was that one of the enforcers reached for her arm. The truth stunned the entire galaxy. Though in that antechamber, only 4 Draconi and 1 very frightened ambassador got to witness it. First, Corven moved. Not fast in the way she expected fast to look. No blur, no dramatic leap. He simply arrived somewhere he hadn't been a moment before, and the enforcer reaching for Vell was suddenly on the floor with a dislocated shoulder, making a sound she'd never heard a Draconi make. The other 3 came at him together. Professional soldiers, armored, trained. It didn't matter. Corven fought like something that had spent its whole life expecting the ground itself to betray it. Low center of gravity, no wasted motion. Every strike aimed at a joint or a seam in the armor with the precision of someone who'd studied Draconi anatomy specifically because he'd known someday he might need to. He took hits. He didn't flinch from them. A clawed backhand that would have shattered a human jaw in any hole of it. Vell had ever watched instead, just turned his head slightly, and he came back swinging, 90 seconds. That was all it took. The queen suddenly froze. Except there was no queen here, only Ambassador Vell Kaathrix, standing very still against the wall. Good. Watching a man she'd dismissed as decorative dismantle 4 armed soldiers with his bare hands and then immediately kneel down to check if they were still breathing. That was the detail that stayed with her, not the violence. The checking which brought them back to the negotiation chamber, where Speaker Vantu now stared at Corven Ashe with an expression Vell had never seen on a Draconi face before. Fear, yes. But underneath it, something closer to respect. You could have killed them, Vantu said slowly. All 4. Easily. Why didn't you? Corven considered the question like it deserved a real answer, because to him, it did. Where I'm from, he said. You learn early that killing something isn't the same as solving a problem. Half the things that could kill you on Earth were just trying to survive too. You put them down when you have to. You don't do it when you don't have to. That's not weakness. He glanced at the enforcers, now stirring, groaning. That's discipline. The council had made a terrible mistake. But not the one they thought. Vantu had assumed humanity's restraint was softness. Vell realized, watching the speaker's expression crumble in real time, that he was only now understanding the truth. Restraint from a species capable of this wasn't weakness at all. It was a choice. And a species that chose mercy while holding that much violence in reserve was infinitely more dangerous than one that simply lashed out. The speaker sat back down. Slowly, carefully. Perhaps, he said, his voice notably smaller than it had been an hour earlier, we should discuss the mineral rights as originally proposed, equitably. Later, on the transport shuttle home, Vell sat across from Corven, who was quietly icing his split knuckles like it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. You could have told me, she said, what you were, what your species survived. I would have trusted you sooner. Corven considered this for a long moment, the same careful consideration he gave every question that actually mattered to him. Would you have? He asked. Or would you have been afraid of me too? Vell didn't have an answer for that. Not yet, but she noticed, for the first time, that she wasn't afraid now. She was something else entirely, something that felt, strangely, like standing next to a mountain that had decided, quietly and without fanfare, to be gentle. For what it's worth, she said finally, thank you for not telling me sooner, and for not killing them. Corven allowed himself the smallest smile she'd ever seen on him. Where I'm from, he said. That's just called Tuesday. The shuttle sailed on through the dark, carrying home a species the galaxy had, finally, quietly, begun to fear and to respect.